The first 100 days, a period of just dynamic energy, massive amount of legislation thrown before Congress, most of it very quickly considered, some of it disputed, but in the midst of the crisis that was 1933, and with a Democratic House and Senate, Franklin Roosevelt was in a position to push legislation through quickly, and Congress was in no position to resist effectively. I've given you a sense, I hope, of the sort of divided purposes that often were embodied in these pieces of legislation. The sense that there were mixtures of some legislation being conservative, some legislation being quite radical, some legislation simultaneously being quite radical and some conservative. Also, this notion that part of the emphasis here was getting the economy turned around, and that meant restoring the confidence of the American people. There was perhaps no better way to do that than to look busy. And that's exactly what Roosevelt seems to be doing in the early days of 1933. It's not as if he's got a real plan, perhaps. Less that than it is Roosevelt understands that moving legislation through is the important thing. And he has this sort of way, Roosevelt does, of sorting it out, in the future. It was often the case that he would use cabinet members and the people who ran the various agencies set up under this legislation. He would use these individuals to run sort of redundant agencies. In other words, in essence, they're doing the same thing, really to see which could be done most effectively and most efficiently. And then in the end, once he determined which was the most effective and efficient agency, he'd let the one die from lack of appropriation and let the other survive. So it's very much a kind of a political selection, if you will. One survives and one dies off, and the mutation lives on in a political sense. Well, anywho, let me just run through some of the legislation that's passed in the first 100 days. I've mentioned the Emergency Banking Act, and this should all be up on a slide for you, the Economy Act, and the Beer and Wine Revenue Act. I have mentioned the Emergency Conservation Work Act. But there are a few things I haven't mentioned. Roosevelt will push legislation to end the gold standard, to end America's reliance on the gold standard, and to begin using silver as a basis for a reserve for American currency, thus doing what our old friend the Farmers Alliance talked about as early as Ocala, Florida, and their platform there in regard to free silver. Wow, that's a pretty radical idea. You'll see that again and again with the New Deal. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, or Act, I guess I should say, will create one of the first agencies that is engaging in direct relief. And that'll be the Civilian Works Administration, the CWA. The CWA will use not loans, as Hoover had suggested the government do to provide work relief, but indeed will use outright grants. In other words, the emphasis is not on repayment of the debt. The emphasis for Roosevelt is getting the money out and into the pockets of American citizens. And if government will make work to do that, or chooses to do that, and use its money in that way, that is acceptable to Franklin Roosevelt. It does raise a bit of a question, however. That's not the way government had functioned in the past. Government had never fulfilled that task in the American economic system of creating jobs and paying people directly short of government jobs, civil service jobs. Harry Hopkins, one of the major advisors to Roosevelt during the New Deal, actually said, and I quote, "It is probably," meaning the CWA and the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, it is probably going to undermine the independence of hundreds of thousands of families. It's not going to derail the New Deal or the first 100 days, but this sort of nagging sense that all of the activity of government, the new role for government in the lives of millions upon millions of Americans, that government becomes the provider of a paycheck, direct assistance, there's a nagging sense, a nagging fear that the relationship of the citizen to the government is threatened, that the independence of the citizen is threatened, that what is increasingly to be the case will be a relationship of dependence, not a relationship in which the citizen votes independently, casts a vote based on their own self-interest, but in which their interests are so tied to those of the government that provides them the necessities of life that independence to vote one's conscience is lost. It's an old argument. It goes back to Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams. It's well worthy of debate. And it's the point to be, I guess, debated here. Has Roosevelt gone too far? Has Roosevelt not gone far enough in the programs he's proposing? I'll let you figure that one out. But historians have debated that for decades. And it is a worthwhile question to ask ourselves as voters and as citizens, when has government done enough? When has government perhaps done too much? The Glass-Steagall Banking Act. It's another one of those important acts that's worthy of consideration because it still impacts our lives today. And I mentioned to you in the earlier lecture that when banks failed prior to this act, which was passed in June of 1933, when banks failed, money of depositors was lost. The Glass-Steagall Banking Act, along with establishing regulations for the banking industry, will also establish the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, or FDIC, an insurance system paid into by banks which provided that depositors could expect to have their money returned to them should a bank encounter financial difficulty up to a certain amount of deposits. It's something that FDIC sign that you'll often see when you walk into a bank today. Other concerns of this early legislation included dealing with the stock market, and that would be addressed in part by the Federal Securities Act in 1933, unemployment. But there's one more little thing I'd like to mention before I move on to the three big ones that I really want to emphasize here. And that is home and land ownership. One of the things that's become sort of important to me in the last several months because of some work I've done and some classes I've taught that I probably haven't emphasized enough in the past has been the degree to which the federal government, since the New Deal, subsidized certain activities, subsidizes farming to a certain extent, but the federal government also subsidizes in this country home ownership. And we can argue about whether that subsidy is worthwhile, but certainly it's a subsidy that tends to benefit particular groups in American society, those who are wealthy enough to actually own a home. It's also been a program that through much of its history has been tied to race. But even in 1933, through the Homeowners Loan Act, through the Farm Credit Act, and through other legislation, the federal government is becoming intimately involved in, one, staving off credit and other issues for farmers, which goes all the way back to the Farmers Alliance, but also encouraging the idea of home ownership in the United States. Helping farmers and homeowners. That's something that's going to come back and come back through the 20th century, and something well worth considering. I think what I'm going to do is stop this segment now, and I'm going to do a subsequent segment where I deal with the big three. And so you'll know ahead of time, by the big three, at least they're the big three for me, I want to talk about the Agricultural Adjustment Act, also part of the first 100 days, the creation of the Tennessee Valley Authority, and the last one would be the National Industrial Recovery Act. These are three that, well, I want you to know them all, and that'd be great. All that we've mentioned or I've mentioned, these three, if you can get those down, if you can get those in your head, it's going to be really beneficial to understanding the New Deal.